He was never finished with her. Not after she survived, not after she escaped. Because to him, she wasn't the one who got away. She was the one he was always coming back for.
Welcome back, kittens, to part 2 of episode 4. Although, with how gruesome this book turns out, you may have regrets. In this episode, we will be covering the second book in the Butcher and the Wren series, The Butcher Game, by Alaina Urquhart. This horror thriller novel was published in 2024 and had fans begging for more. I definitely was. I can't say enough about how much I adore Alaina and her unique ability to craft a fictional novel that feels incredibly real, and it sucks you in from the very first sentence. And of course, we already talked about the author, Alaina Urquhart, in the last episode, and honestly, she needs no introduction at this point. But I'm still going to hype her up because she just dropped her third book, The Butcher Legacy. It's officially out now for pre-order at a Barnes & Noble and Target near you. You already know I'll be reading it soon. It's on my to-be-read list, which is ever-growing. And yes, another episode will cover the third book. So keep your eye out because we are not done with the story yet. Anyways, in this book, we continue with Jeremy and his psychotic mind game he begins to play with the New Orleans Police Department. And let me tell you, it is one wild ride. So buckle up, my murder mitten kitten colony, and let's tear into this masterpiece. Okay, so imagine this. You're in a quiet town, one of those places where nothing ever really happens. The kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked and everyone knows everyone. And then one day, the news breaks. Not just any news, but something that will rock the city to its core. A serial killer has been caught. But not just any serial killer. Jeremy Rose, the Bayou Butcher. And instead of shock, instead of disbelief, there's just this quiet, creeping fear because the man watching that news, Philip Trudeau, doesn't see a monster revealed. He sees a ghost from his past, slowly crawling its way back to life. Philip has built a life that should feel safe, structured around faith and routine in the Berkshires. But the fear that settles into him isn't new. It's a vivid, violent memory. And it pulls him back to a night he has spent years trying to forget. It didn't start as something unforgivable. It started with a mistake. One bad decision to drive drunk. Then, bam! He was standing over a young woman he had hit with his car. Still alive, still breathing, begging for help. And that's not even the worst part. Instead of helping the woman, he turns to his passenger, Jeremy, for help. There's no hesitation in the way Jeremy steps in. No pause, just control, as he drags her into the woods and turns an accident into something fatal. After Jeremy kills her, he buries her and leaves Philip's school ID behind. Not carelessly, but deliberately, making sure this would never truly disappear and that Philip would never be free of it. While the past waits to resurface, Wren Mueller is dealing with something far more immediate. She didn't just hear about Jeremy. She survived him. And survival doesn't look the way people expect it to. It looks like exhaustion, like memories that won't stay in the past, like a constant awareness that something unfinished is still out there. She steps away from her work as a forensic pathologist, but distance doesn't bring relief. Because as long as Jeremy is free, nothing feels safe. That quiet understanding sits beneath everything, shaping her decisions in ways that almost feel inevitable. Jeremy, meanwhile, is already moving with the kind of foresight that makes him incredibly dangerous. His stop in West Virginia isn't random. It's preparation paying off. as he digs up an emergency kit he had buried long ago, thinking he may need it someday. Even the man who offers him a ride becomes part of that pattern, because Jeremy doesn't see kindness as something to return. He sees it as an opportunity. He inevitably decides to kill this innocent man, just because he can, and takes his truck and wallet. And by the time he continues driving north, there's nothing he fears of getting in his way of finding Wren. When he reaches the Berkshires, he doesn't rush into violence. Instead, he moves quietly, slipping into empty homes, learning the town, understanding its rhythm, and it begins to feel less like hiding and more like staging. That intention sharpens when Wren gets the call from Corinne about a body found outside a New Orleans-themed bakery. There's nothing obvious tying it to Jeremy, but Wren doesn't need obvious. Once you've seen someone like him up close, you can recognize the patterns even when they change. And that recognition pulls her in despite the fear. The state of Massachusetts should feel like distance from everything she went through. But instead, there's a tension just beneath the surface, something that becomes clearer as the violence unfolds. The couple found at the ruins of an old mansion aren't random victims, not with a symbol carved into their bodies. It's specific. It's personal. And when magnolias begin appearing throughout town, Wren's specific wedding flowers, it stops feeling coincidental entirely. It feels like a message from him taunting her in the shadows. As the killings continue, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The woman taken from the bar and hunted through the woods isn't just another victim. The way Jeremy handles it changes everything, stretching fear into something prolonged, something controlled. And that same control carries into his return to Philip. When Jeremy forces his way back into his life, it isn't a confrontation. It's a reminder. The past hasn't loosened its grip, and now the threat extends beyond Philip to his family, making resistance feel almost impossible. By the time Wren and LaRue began connecting the details, Jeremy has already moved beyond what local law enforcement is ready for, using their hesitation to stay ahead. The lake incident adds another layer, with a woman forced into the water and hunted even as she tries to reach safety. And what's left behind turns into something symbolic as well as violent. Wren sees the pattern clearly, even as others hesitate. And that gap becomes dangerous as Jeremy shifts his focus closer to her. The fairgrounds are where everything becomes undeniable. The body hidden there, the care taken in how it's left, and the message concealed within the victim's eye leave no room for distance. When Wren unfolds it and sees one word, Richard, everything shifts at once. When she calls and gets no answer, and then receives a message from his phone confirming Jeremy has him, it stops being about understanding his messages and starts to become a race against the clock to save her husband. What follows feels chaotic, but it's still controlled from behind the scenes, with Jeremy sending false locations and pulling police in every direction, stretching them thin while he stays ahead. Even when he's found in Philip's basement, it doesn't feel like resolution, because something about Philip no longer fits the role he seemed to play. When it's revealed that he moved the original body years earlier, it reframes everything, suggesting he was never just a victim of Jeremy's control. By the time Richard is found in the woods, it feels like the end of something Jeremy set in motion long before anyone realized it. Wren is left in the aftermath, trying to process not just the loss, but the realization that Jeremy wasn't alone in the way she believed. The truth about Philip leaves the story feeling less contained, something that lingers instead of resolves. Even though he knew that Jeremy wasn't truly in control of his life because of the car accident, he still participated in killing Richard. This alone suggests that Philip was never a good old pillar of the community. He was just as sick and twisted as Jeremy. The only difference being, he can get away with it because of his family's involvement in the town's justice system. And even with Jeremy behind bars, it doesn't fully end. There's still something unfinished, something that pulls Wren back when she sees her name on Jeremy's approved visitors list. Her decision to go isn't about closure in the usual sense. It's about understanding, about facing something that still feels unresolved. And that choice leaves the story sitting in that uncomfortable space where it doesn't really end. It just waits. So now that we've gone through everything that happens in this story, I want to take a minute to talk about a few of the people behind it. Because while we already know Wren, LaRue, and Jeremy, this book introduces someone who really shifts everything. First up is Philip Trudeau. And Philip is interesting because he doesn't feel like a villain at first. He's a pastor in Great Barrington, someone who's lived there his whole life, someone people trust. On the surface, he's exactly the kind of person you wouldn't question. But the more you sit with him, the more things start to feel off. His marriage is falling apart. There's a pattern of him crossing lines with women in his church. And it becomes clear pretty quickly that the image he presents isn't the full picture. What's really unsettling is that Philip is quietly connected to the story from the very beginning. We just don't recognize it at first. In the first book, Jeremy leaves behind a library card with one of his victims, and it comes across as just another one of his strange, unsettling habits. It doesn't seem meaningful in the moment, but looking back, that detail carries more weight than it initially appears. Then, when we finally meet Philip in this book, he's watching the news about Jeremy being exposed, completely unfazed. There's no shock, no disbelief, just a sense that he already knows exactly who Jeremy is and exactly what he's capable of. And that's because their history goes way back. As teenagers, they spent their time together drinking, doing reckless things, the kind of behavior that should have had, consequences. But for Philip, it never really did. His father is a powerful judge. So he grows up in this space where he's protected, even when he shouldn't be. That includes the night he hit a woman while drunk driving. She was still alive, and that moment could have gone very differently. But instead of getting help, Philip turned to Jeremy. And Jeremy didn't hesitate. He finished it, buried her, and made sure Philip could never walk away from it by leaving his ID with the body. At first, it kind of feels like Philip is just stuck, like he's being controlled by whatever Jeremy has over him. But the more the story unfolds, the less that explanation really works. Because Philip isn't just afraid, he's comfortable hiding things. He's good at it. And eventually, it becomes clear that Jeremy didn't create that darkness in him. He just gave it space. And honestly, that's what makes Philip so dangerous. It's not just what he does, it's how well he blends in. He's in a position where people trust him automatically, and he knows exactly how to use that. Even the way he turns on Jeremy doesn't feel like justice. It feels calculated, like he's just removing a problem. By the end, Jeremy almost feels like the obvious threat, and Philip is the one you didn't see coming. Then there's Richard. We've met him before, but in this book, he matters in a much bigger way. He comes into Wren's life after everything she's been through, and instead of trying to fix her, he just meets her where she is. He's kind, he's steady, and he's the kind of person who actually means the things he says. What really stands out about him is how fully he accepts her, even when she opens up about the parts of her past that are tied to Jeremy, the parts she feels guilt or shame around. He doesn't hesitate. He just makes it clear that none of that changes how he sees her. And that kind of support isn't loud or dramatic, but it's everything to her. Their relationship becomes this really important contrast to Jeremy because what Jeremy believes he has with Wren is obsessive and one-sided. But what she has with Richard is real, it's mutual, it's grounded, and it's actually built on trust. And that's what makes what happens to him hit so hard. Because Richard isn't just her husband. He represents the life she was starting to rebuild. Something stable, something safe. So when he's taken from her, it's not just loss. It's a turning point. It shifts everything for her and becomes a huge part of what drives her forward. And even though he was in the first book, this is where his role expands. He's not just part of her life in the background anymore. He becomes central to her story and to everything she does next. So now that we've talked about the characters, and especially once you really sit with people like Wren, Jeremy, and Philip, I feel like the story starts to shift a little. It stops feeling like just a plot and more like, okay, what is this actually saying? Because there were a few themes that kept popping up for me while I was reading, and I feel like they made everything so much more intense. The first one, and probably the biggest one, is this idea of justice versus revenge. And honestly, where that line even is. Because Wren is someone who, at her core, really believes in justice. Like, that's not just her job, that's how she sees the world. She's literally speaking for people who can't speak anymore, which is already incredibly heavy. And you can feel how seriously she takes that. But at the same time, and this is where I kept pausing while reading, what she went through with Jeremy makes it impossible for this to stay purely professional. Like, I don't care how strong you are, that is definitely personal. And I think that's what makes her so interesting because she's not out here trying to get revenge. She's not trying to torture him or anything like that. But she also can't just sit back and let the system handle it. She tries, and every time she does, it just makes everything worse. I feel like for her, justice isn't something she can wait around for. It's something she has to be a part of, even when it's dangerous. And then you look at Jeremy, and he's the complete opposite of that. There is no line for him. Everything he does is about control and revenge, and honestly, hurting Wren. Like, yes, he's killing people, but the way he does it, the things he leaves behind, the messages, it's all meant to get to her. That's the point. So while Wren is trying to find closure, Jeremy is actively trying to make sure she never gets it. And that contrast, it's so uncomfortable, but in a really good way. Another thing that really stood out to me is how the book handles trauma, because it doesn't treat it like something you just get over. Wren technically already survived Jeremy. Like, that part of the story is done. But I kept thinking while reading, she didn't really get to leave it behind her. You can see it in everything she does, the way she thinks, the way she reacts, the way she needs control over her environment. It all comes back to that. And I liked that the book didn't try to make her healing look simple, because healing is never linear or simple at all. Yes, she's in therapy, she's trying, she wants to move forward. But at the same time, part of her healing is tied to this case. She doesn't just want distance from Jeremy. She wants it finished. She wants him caught. She wants it done, because otherwise, it's like this door is just still open. And I think that's such a real feeling. But then the flip side of that, and this is where it gets rough, is that going back into that world pulls her right back into that nightmare. Being in those spaces, seeing those patterns again, it's like her body remembers everything, even when she's trying to stay in control. And I kept thinking, she's holding it together, barely. And Even in the end, there's still that sense that Jeremy isn't fully out of her life, even if he's physically gone. And that's super unsettling. And then the last theme that I feel like runs through everything in this book is power and obsession. Jeremy is just completely consumed by both. His obsession with Wren isn't normal. It's not even close. And what really got me is that it's not even about her as a person. It's about what she represents to him. She's the one who got away, the one thing he couldn't control. Instead of letting that go, he builds this entire narrative that they're connected in some creepy, psychotic way. And I was like, no, absolutely not. In his mind, it makes sense. Everything he does in this book is about trying to pull her back into that, to reestablish that control. And then on top of that, the way he treats victims, it's never just about killing. It's about control, about fear, about stretching those moments out. That's where he feels powerful. It's honestly disturbing how calm he is in that. What I found really interesting, and this is where it all kind of comes together, is that while Jeremy is so focused on controlling everything, he completely overlooks Philip. Like, he's so locked in on Wren, so obsessed with her, that he doesn't even realize what's right in front of him. That ends up being one of his biggest mistakes. Absolutely crazy, fantastic, and I cannot wait to read the next installment. Alrighty, so we've made it to my Claw and Order segment. For this week's Claw and Order segment, I want to build a little bit off of what we talked about last episode because we went into Dennis Rader, also known as BTK, another deeply twisted serial killer. And while I was reading this book, I started noticing similar patterns again, this time with someone else. Israel Keyes. And the more I thought about it, the more these connections to Jeremy just kept clicking into place. So, if you're not familiar with Keyes, I'll give you a quick overview, but this is one of those cases that feels unsettling in a very different way. Israel Keyes was active roughly between the early 2000s and 2012. And what makes his case so difficult and honestly so scary is that investigators believed he committed crimes all over the United States. He lived in Alaska, but he traveled constantly, targeting victims in different states, including places like Washington, Vermont, and Texas. So there wasn't one single hunting ground. It was everywhere. And he wasn't caught because of some long investigation finally catching up to him. He was caught in 2012 after abducting a woman in Alaska. He had stolen her debit card and ended up using her card, which ultimately led to him being tracked down in Texas. And that's the part that always gets me. After years of planning, years of getting away with it, it ends with something almost so small, almost careless. But before that, he was incredibly methodical. He wasn't impulsive. He wasn't sloppy. He was patient. Like years of planning kind of patient. He would bury what he called kill kits across the country. Literally buckets filled with weapons, cash, supplies, all hidden and waiting so that whenever he decided to act, everything was already in place. And immediately I was like, okay, Jeremy, that same level of foresight, that same feeling of this isn't random. This is something you've been preparing for long before anyone else even knew you existed. Keyes also made it a point to travel constantly, crossing state lines specifically to avoid patterns, which, again, very Jeremy coded. There's this intentional distance between him and the crime, and he's always just out of reach, always one step ahead. But I think the part that really stuck with me and honestly made me pause is how detached he was. When Keyes talked about what he didn't sound emotional or chaotic. He sounded controlled, calm, cool, and collected, like he was describing a fictional story, not the killings of innocent people. And that's something we see in Jeremy too. It's not just about violence, it's about control. It's about the experience of it. It's about having power in those moments. One difference that I think is really interesting is the obsession piece. Keyes didn't fixate on one specific person the way Jeremy does with Wren. His victims were often random, spread across different places, which somehow makes it even more unsettling because there's no clear reason behind it. It's not personal, and that randomness makes it feel like it could happen to anyone. Jeremy, on the other hand, makes everything personal. He takes that same need for control and layers obsession on top of it. He wants Wren involved, emotionally affected, pulled into everything he's doing. He's not just committing crimes, he's building something around her. At the core of both of them, you still see the same patterns: planning, control, detachment, power. And I think that's why this comparison stuck with me so much, because Jeremy doesn't feel unrealistic. He feels like an exaggerated version of something that already exists, which, in my opinion, makes him even more terrifying. Because it's not like this could never happen, it's more like it already kind of has. All right, my Murder Mitten Kitten colony. If you made it to the end of this episode, you already know I appreciate you so much for being here and diving into the story with me. If you want to keep up with everything I'm working on, you can follow the podcast over on Instagram and TikTok at Murder Mitten Kittens BC to view some fun behind the scenes content and announcements of when new episodes drop. And of course, you can listen to Murder Mitten Kittens Book Club wherever you get your podcasts: Spotify, Apple, Amazon Music, and YouTube. If you're enjoying the podcast, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, leave a rating or a review. It really does help more people find the show, and it helps me keep bringing you more dark, cozy content. And as always, stay safe, stay cozy, and maybe don't trust the quiet pillars of the community. I'll see you next time.